The world did not expect this. Not from a small, landlocked nation in West Africa. Not from a captain barely in his 30s. Yet, on a quiet morning in Ouagadougou, the impossible happened. With just a few words, I ordered the CIA to leave Burkina Faso. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sent a tremor through Washington that still hasn't stopped echoing. 48 hours, that was all he gave them. No negotiations, no polite letters, no diplomatic smiles, just a ticking clock. The United States called it a security cooperation base. But when Burkina Faso officers uncovered encrypted antennas and locked rooms, even they could not enter, the illusion shattered. What the West called protection, Traoré called surveillance. What they called partnership, he called control. And so for the first time in modern African history, an African leader didn't just expose the deception, he acted on it. His order wasn't merely about expelling agents. It was about expelling an entire era, a silent form of supervision that had lasted for decades under the banner of aid and counterterrorism. Think about this for a second. A nation the size of Colorado just told the world's most powerful intelligence agency to pack up and go home. What does that mean for the balance of power in Africa? What does it mean for Washington's invisible hand across the Sahel? Tonight, the question burning through the continent and through history itself is simple. Has Africa finally drawn the line against Western oversight? Or has Burkina Faso just started a fight far bigger than itself? If you believe that the truth is more powerful than the headlines, stay with us. Because what you're about to hear may redefine the meaning of sovereignty, not just for Burkina Faso, but for every nation that has ever lived under someone else's watch. Please share this video if you stand for independence. And subscribe if you believe that Africa's story deserves to be told by Africans themselves. It began not with rumors, not with leaks, but with a voice. A soldier's voice, steady, clear, and unafraid. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before his nation on national television and said the words no African leader had ever dared to say in public. All U.S. intelligence personnel, including CIA operatives, have 48 hours to leave Burkina Faso. No hesitation, no hidden diplomacy. Just a countdown. In that moment, you could feel the air in the room tighten, not just in Ouagadougou, but across the world. Washington's policymakers scrambled their earpieces, buzzing with disbelief. No one expected this kind of defiance from a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. For years, the United States had called its presence in Burkina Faso a partnership for counterterrorism. But when Burkina Faso officers began tracing strange signal transmissions during their own security meetings, they discovered something deeply unsettling. The signals didn't lead to rebel camps or terrorist networks, they led back to foreign servers. Further inspection revealed that the so-called Joint Intelligence Center on the outskirts of Ouagadougou wasn't what it appeared to be. Behind its reinforced gates stood antennas built for aerial signal interception, encrypted communication lines routed through external satellites, and sealed rooms that even local soldiers were forbidden to enter. The truth hit like a thunderclap. The base wasn't protecting Burkina Faso, it was watching it. What had been marketed as security cooperation was in reality a sophisticated spy hub designed to monitor government communications, military movements, and even internal cabinet meetings. That's when Captain Traoré decided enough was enough. He didn't call for an investigation. He didn't negotiate new terms. He simply ordered them out. Within hours of his televised address, Burkina Faso security officers surrounded the compound, ensuring that no data servers or hard drives could leave without authorization. Soldiers stood at every gate. Trucks idled on the roadside, engines humming under the afternoon sun, waiting for orders to escort the Americans to the airport. To outsiders, it looked like a quiet operation, but to those who understood the stakes, it was nothing less than a declaration of independence. For decades, Africa had tolerated advisors and technical experts who came bearing the flags of allies but carried the eyes of overseers. Everyone knew it. No one said it. Until that day, the American embassy released a cautious statement full of the usual diplomatic phrases: ongoing cooperation, mutual respect, shared security goals. But inside Washington, alarm bells rang. The expulsion of U.S. intelligence from a strategically critical Sahel nation was more than an inconvenience. It was a geopolitical earthquake. Burkina Faso's young leader had just shattered one of the quiet understandings of modern geopolitics, that African governments might complain about interference, but they would never act on it. Traore acted, and the effect was immediate. His decision didn't just ripple through Burkina Faso's ministries. It resonated through every intelligence corridor from Langley to Paris. Inside the Sahel, neighboring nations took notice. Mali and Niger, both already members of the new alliance of Sahel states, the AS, saw Traore's move as validation. They too had expelled French troops in the name of sovereignty. Now Burkina Faso had gone further, targeting the very core of Western influence intelligence. Across African social media, his speech spread like wildfire. Short clips of his announcement circulated with captions like, "He speaks for all of us." Africa is not a child to be watched. In marketplaces and cafes, in military barracks and village squares, the same question echoed. If one man can tell the CIA to leave, what else is possible? Meanwhile, inside the U.S. State Department, analysts began to grasp the wider danger. If this sentiment spreads, if other African nations follow, America's entire Sahel strategy could collapse overnight. The security footprint that justified decades of quiet control might vanish with it. But for Traoré, this wasn't about global strategy. It was about dignity. In his own words, Burkina Faso would rather fight alone than live under invisible supervision. No anger, no fear, no hatred, only resolve. That's what made the moment so powerful. It wasn't rebellion for its own sake. It was restoration, the reclaiming of a nation's right to stand without permission. And as the 48-hour deadline began to tick, the world watched a small country in the heart of Africa make history not with armies, but with courage. The countdown began. 48 hours to leave, 48 hours to erase decades of quiet control. At the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou, phones rang without pause. Diplomats scrambled for instructions, intelligence officers shredded files, and local employees whispered in disbelief. For years, that compound had operated with absolute confidence. Now it was surrounded by Burkinabe soldiers with orders that needed no explanation. No one leaves with anything not approved by the state. Inside Burkina Faso's capital, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds gathered in the streets, waving flags, chanting songs that hadn't been heard since the revolution of Thomas Sankara. For many citizens, this wasn't just about the CIA. It was about finally standing tall after generations of being watched, lectured, and told what to do. Older men wiped tears from their eyes. Mothers brought their children out to witness history. In those faces, you could see the meaning of the word sovereignty, not as a theory, but as something alive, fragile, and hard-won. Western media outlets reacted instantly. Within hours, major networks ran headlines that read, "Burkina Faso takes a dangerous turn. Young leader risks isolation. Traoré threatens regional stability." The pattern was predictable. The same tone used decades ago against Nkrumah Lumumba and Sankara was now being recycled for Traoré, the tone of warning mixed with condescension. Yet across the African continent, the tone was different. From Bamako to Nairobi, Dar es Salaam to Johannesburg, people shared one clip the moment Traoré looked into the camera and said, "We will not be spied upon in our own home." That single sentence ignited something deeper than politics pride. African commentators, even those who usually avoided controversy, called his act the beginning of a new chapter. Social media exploded with hashtags like Dawn Africa for Africans and Anouran Sovereignty First. Within a day, over 50 million people had viewed the short video on TikTok and YouTube combined. The reactions inside Washington were very different. Behind closed doors, analysts at the State Department and Pentagon held emergency meetings. The CIA director briefed Congress that a critical intelligence node in the Sahel had been compromised. It wasn't just about losing access to Burkina Faso's territory, it was about losing visibility. The entire surveillance grid in West Africa had developed a blind spot. An unnamed intelligence source told The Atlantic, "This is more than an expulsion. It's a message. If Burkina Faso can do it, so can others." And others were already watching closely. In Niger, discussions quietly began about reassessing U.S. cooperation at Airbase 201, one of the largest drone bases in the world. In Mali, military leaders publicly praised Traoré's courage and clarity. In Chad, young officers whispered about when their turn would come. The ripple effect was undeniable. For the first time in modern history, Western presence in Africa, something long considered untouchable, was being openly challenged by those it once claimed to protect. Still, not everyone was celebrating. In European capitals, diplomats accused Traoré of recklessness. They warned of security vacuums and new threats. Yet none could ignore the deeper reality: Africa's younger generation no longer feared standing alone. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, the Burkina government released a detailed statement. It listed specific coordinates, identified agents by name, and confirmed that the CIA facility was being decommissioned under national supervision. Every detail was transparent, a deliberate act of moral clarity. They weren't hiding. They were showing the world what sovereignty looks like when it stops asking for permission. The final hours of the ultimatum were broadcast live. Trucks loaded with equipment rolled out of the compound. American personnel boarded planes under military escort. There was no violence, no chaos, only quiet authority. As the last plane took off into the orange dusk, the streets of Ouagadougou erupted in cheers. Not the cheers of triumph over an enemy, but of liberation from invisibility. Burkina Faso had drawn a line and the world had seen it. Washington could downplay it, the media could distort it, but one fact was now undeniable: the smallest nation in the Sahel had done what others only whispered about. When asked by a journalist what message he wanted to send to the world, Captain Traore simply replied, "We have been watched for too long. Now it is time for Africa to watch itself." That single line captured everything: the defiance, the dignity, and the awakening. The CIA might have left the soil of Burkina Faso, but the echo of that decision traveled far beyond its borders. It wasn't just a political act. It was a moment of collective memory, the point where silence ended and sovereignty began. The morning after the CIA departure, Ouagadougou woke up to a silence unlike any before. No convoys, no coded radio chatter, no foreign badges moving through government offices. Only the hum of local life reclaiming its own rhythm. Yet behind that calm, the consequences of Traore's decision were beginning to unfold, not just in diplomatic cables, but in the hearts and fears of his people. The first impact was economic. Within days, international NGOs began pausing operations for security reasons. A few Western banks tightened credit lines to Burkina Faso institutions. The local currency, the CFA franc, dipped slightly against the euro. Analysts in Washington and Brussels whispered about financial pressure. But in Ouagadougou's markets, people called it by another name: retaliation. President Traore had anticipated it. Long before the expulsion, his administration had been quietly preparing for such a scenario, accelerating plans to nationalize gold, refining redirect agricultural exports to regional buyers, and strengthen trade within the Alliance of Sahel States AES. Let them close their accounts, one Burkina Faso economist said on television. We will open our own. Still, the tension was real. Foreign aid, though often overstated, had lubricated much of Burkina Faso's fragile economy. Washington's leverage didn't rely on troops or drones, it relied on access. The moment Traore cut that cord, he risked more than just diplomatic fallout. He risked hunger, unemployment, and isolation. In the civil sphere, the reaction was mixed. Urban elites who had long benefited from Western partnerships worried about the future scholarships contracts, international exchanges. But in the villages and mining towns, support for Traore surged. Ordinary citizens saw in him a reflection of something long denied: a leader who valued dignity over dependency. Posters began appearing in the streets reading, "No more masters, no more puppets. Burkina belongs to Burkina Faso." At night, students gathered at university campuses to debate the meaning of sovereignty. "What if this is just the beginning?" one young man asked. "What if we finally learn to build without them?" The conversation had shifted. For the first time in decades, the word independence wasn't tied to flags or anthems, it was tied to control of data, gold, and information. Politically, Traore's government became both admired and isolated. Neighboring Mali and Niger stood firmly beside him, calling the decision a necessary act of self-defense. But regional blocs like ECOWAS and the African Union expressed concern, echoing the diplomatic language of the West. Some leaders feared the precedent it might set, that their own citizens might demand the same. Inside the country, opposition voices accused Traore of gambling with the nation's stability. They warned that sanctions could cripple public services, but his supporters responded with a single argument: "We have already been poor. At least now we are poor on our own terms." The symbolism grew larger than the politics. What began as a military directive had evolved into a moral statement. Churches held prayers for protection. Imams spoke of a new dawn for Africa. In one emotional broadcast, an elderly woman from the town of Kaya said, "My son died fighting terrorists. Now I know what he fought for: our freedom from those who pretend to help us." Her words traveled further than any policy paper ever could. And as days turned into weeks, something remarkable happened. The predicted collapse never came. Shops stayed open. Food kept moving. The army remained disciplined. The feared chaos simply didn't materialize. Instead, a new confidence began to take root, not loud, not boastful, but steady. Burkina Faso had survived its first test of sovereignty, yet everyone knew this was just the beginning. For every friend gained in Africa, a door was closing in the West. For every handshake from Bamako, a glare from Washington. But in the eyes of the people, Traore had already won the most important battle, the battle for dignity. And in a world where small nations are often forced to bow, standing upright had become the boldest act of all. In Washington, the mood turned from confusion to calculation. The State Department's first instinct was to minimize the story, to treat Traore's order as a temporary misunderstanding. But as intelligence cables poured in confirming that the CIA base had indeed gone dark, that illusion evaporated. In Langley, analysts watched satellite feeds of trucks leaving the compound and realized what had just been lost: not just a station, but visibility. For nearly 2 decades, the Sahel had been an open window into Africa's security landscape. Every drone flight, every radio transmission, every political meeting quietly monitored and archived. Now that window had slammed shut. The United States suddenly found itself blind in a region it once considered a pillar of its counterterrorism strategy. Reports leaked to the press described a significant intelligence gap. Privately, senior officials worried about something far greater: the symbolic contagion. If Burkina Faso's defiance inspired others, the entire architecture of Western surveillance in Africa could begin to unravel. At the Pentagon, discussions turned tactical. Could Niger or Ghana serve as alternative hubs? Could training programs be restructured to preserve presence without appearance? But the more they planned, the more it became clear the narrative had shifted. Traore had changed the conversation from security to sovereignty. And in global politics, narratives matter more than bases. American media struggled to frame the story. Some outlets portrayed him as a dangerous populist drifting toward Moscow. Others warned of Russian influence creeping into the Sahel. Yet beneath the familiar headlines, a different truth was emerging. The United States, long seen as the guarantor of order, was being outmaneuvered not by military force, but by moral clarity. In Europe, reactions were uneasy. Paris, already bruised by its expulsion from Mali, and Niger viewed Burkina Faso's move as the final blow to its post-colonial influence. The European Union issued a cautious statement, urging dialogue and restraint. But across the continent, from the streets of Dakar to the markets of Addis Ababa, people were no longer listening to Western statements. They were watching actions. And those actions, from Sahel to the Red Sea, told a clear story: Africa was redrawing its alliances. Russia's foreign ministry hailed Traore's decision as a sovereign right long overdue. Chinese diplomats, more subtle but equally strategic, spoke of mutually respectful partnerships. Even Turkey hinted at new defense agreements, positioning itself as a mediator between Africa's awakening and the old global order. For Washington, this was the nightmare scenario: not just losing influence, but losing moral authority. For decades, American power in Africa wasn't only built on weapons or aid, it was built on the belief that its leadership was inevitable. Now that belief was cracking. Inside think tanks, policymakers began using a new phrase: the Sahel vacuum. A space once dominated by Western influence, now being filled by actors the U.S. could neither predict nor control. But what they failed to understand was that this vacuum wasn't created by others moving in. It was created by Africans finally standing up. Even within America, a quiet curiosity began to spread. On social media, voices from the Black diaspora, scholars, veterans, artists, started asking, why should we call a man reckless for wanting to protect his nation's dignity? When did sovereignty become a crime? For many African Americans, Traore's defiance resonated deeply, an echo of every fight for freedom that once shook their own homeland. So while Washington debated strategies and Europe drafted resolutions, something more profound was happening. Burkina Faso had entered the world's consciousness, not as a victim, not as a dependent, but as a sovereign actor rewriting the rules. And for the first time in a long time, the world wasn't watching Africa through Western eyes. It was watching the West through African courage. As the dust settles over Ouagadougou, one truth remains: a young soldier has forced the world to look again at what freedom truly means. Not the kind written in treaties or promised in aid packages, but the kind that begins with a word. Burkina Faso's defiance has opened a door that cannot easily be closed. Across the Sahel, leaders are now asking themselves whether security partnerships have really kept their nations safe or simply watched them from the shadows. And in Washington, the question is no less haunting: if Africa no longer accepts supervision, what role will the West play in a continent that refuses to be managed? The coming months will test more than just Burkina Faso's resilience. They will test the world's willingness to accept a new balance, one where the weak no longer whisper and the powerful no longer dictate. History has seen this before: when Nasser took the Suez Canal, when Sankara refused the IMF, when Mandela walked free. Each time, the world warned of chaos. Each time, dignity endured. But courage has a price. Sanctions may come. Smear campaigns may follow. Yet no punishment can erase what has already begun an awakening. So tonight, let us ask ourselves, is this the dawn of a truly independent Africa, or the beginning of a global struggle for control disguised as cooperation? If you believe that truth is worth defending, that dignity still matters more than power, share this story. And subscribe if you believe that Africa's future should be written not in Washington or Paris, but in Ouagadougou.